Hey everyone, welcome to the Ideation Podcast. This podcast is an on-the-go podcast designed to help you move your ideas through better implementation. In each episode, you'll hear from thought leaders in multiple industries, share about how they implement their ideas in order to make them remarkable, that is worth making a remark about. And I'm your host, Charles Lee, and super excited to interview a good friend of mine today to discuss AI moving from myths to mastery. Jeff Eyet here is a visionary leader who has dedicated his career to bridging the gap between academic rigor and practical business solutions. He is currently the managing partner of the Berkeley Innovation Group and is also a professor at UC Berkeley Haas's School of Business. Jeff regularly works with companies and individuals on integrating and implementing AI-driven business strategies. So, Jeff, first of all, thanks for making time for our audience. I'm super excited to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on the other side of the mic for a change.
That's right. You have a podcast going as well. And so it's always great to be on each other's shows. So, Jeff, thanks so much for being here. You know, I know we've been friends for a while and we've had so many different conversations about AI. And I think one of the things that is really daunting for people is this sense of like uncertainty. I remember you once telling me, and I think we were actually doing a panel together, and you said like most people who are, playing around with the tools have spent actually less than 10 hours. Like that seems to be kind of a break point where, talk to us a little bit about like how attainable understanding around AI is, and then we can get into some of the myths.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. To your point, most people have spent less than 10 hours for a couple reasons. First, they probably engaged with a very early version of the software or of the model, I should say, that may have hallucinated, may have given very vague answers, or may have just given factually incorrect information. And that's a turnoff. Second thing is you have to understand how to communicate with the LLM. And if you don't sort of give it some context, give it some what it should optimize for, what the output should look like, it's going to come in with a subpar response. But those people who really engage it correctly, I'd like to say AI is basically a good intern at this point, moving to an entry-level associate at your firm.
That's good. So let's jump in a little bit to some of the common myths around what AI, what people perceive it to be, and thus it may be a barrier to entry, barrier to participation. But talk to us a little bit about what are some common myths you come across as you advise people in this space?
Great question. The first thing I run into is people think if you say the words AI, it means they're going to lose their job. Yeah. And I go back to and give the example of Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel may have put a few bookkeepers out of business in terms of the people actually entering data into the ledger, if you will. But really, the majority of people upskilled their abilities and took on some analyst capabilities, and we're able to bigger sets of data, derive more insights, and drive more business value. So that's the first misconception I hear, and kind of how I like to counter that. The second misconception I think people make is that if I give it my data, it's going to steal my data and it's going to be available to the internet. And it's not like if I put my credit card number in the comment section here, right, I'd be in trouble. But what AI does is it takes the text that you give it, breaks it into chunks, and converts those chunks into alphanumeric strings, vectors. And those vectors are then fed into a database. So the database is just really getting a random set of numbers. And if I hacked that database, if you will, that's all I would get. It would have no context to me. So again, obviously I'm not purporting putting your personal identifiable information into it. But that said, if you think about putting your data into the entire internet that has been scraped to train these models, the likelihood of you being exposed, if you will, or your secrets being let out are probably very low compared to the value that you get from the analysis these LLMs can provide.
Awesome. So, there is that fear. So your belief far as like people being concerned about their positions, it's an additive kind of tool that can enhance the work we already do.
Today, yes, absolutely. In 5 years' time, as agents become more prevalent, I'm sure that's going to begin to further erode the traditional roles that are safe with the skills they have today. And that's why the 10-hour window is so important. That 10 hours of experimenting today, think about the first 10 hours that you invested in tinkering with Microsoft Excel. Even if it wasn't for work, maybe you were just doing your family's budget or playing with baseball statistics, whatever it was, you became more trained in that, and those skills carried on to your professional career. So today I look for low stakes opportunities to play with LLMs. Plan a vacation, plan your meals for the day, or just maybe try and create a little study bot for your child in their school preparation, but keep it simple.
That's good. So I think it's always helpful for me, like engaging a new area to kind of understand some of the key words or, terms that are being thrown around. So it's not confusing. I know in AI, there's everything from like AI to machine learning to LLMs, and you've kind of mentioned it in passing. So give our viewers a little bit, if they are new to this, like what do all these words mean? And how can they kind of create a framework in their mind so they can understand when people are talking about artificial intelligence?
So artificial intelligence is really a big umbrella term. And as you go underneath that artificial intelligence, you may have heard the phrase multimodal models. And these multimodal models are really just, think of yourself as a human. You see things, you hear things, you talk, you can manipulate objects, right? All of those inputs fall under artificial intelligence. Where it starts to get more narrow is this, what you've heard of as machine learning. And machine learning has been around for a long time. And think about training a robot, right? Like, yes, how hard a robot on a automotive assembly line, right? How hard does it clasp onto that door so that it doesn't dent it, but prevents it from slipping to move it into position, and continually iterating on that. That's an example of machine learning. Another example I like to do is, you probably remember from a while ago, is it a wiener dog or a dog in a hot dog costume, right? What is that? And again, that training of yes, no, that reinforcement learning, it falls under machine learning. But then underneath machine learning, kind of at the core of what we're dealing with today, are the LLMs, or large language models. And these have scraped the corpus of the entire internet and brought them in. And why they call it a neural network is because it's meant to model your brain. When I get a stimulus, it goes, right, the neurons, one end of the neuron fires, the end of the next neuron captures it, and so forth. And it's this chain reaction to my brain and then back to my body to react to. This is what computers do. They're basically stimulating the system, if you will, from all of the information in the internet. Right. And now that neural network's a black box. Even the companies will tell you they don't know what happens in that black box. And then there's the output that ChatGPT or whatever returns to you. So again, thinking about that in a backwards order, we've scraped the entire internet, put it into a black box. We get these outputs, right? These outputs that then stimulate us in terms of what we see, hear, think, etc. And that's artificial intelligence. So I'll pause there. I know that was a lot, but if it's a pretty linear path if you think about it that way. And we can talk more about generative AI and some of the other buzzwords, but I'll stop there.
No, that's really, really helpful in kind of framing it. I mean, when I think about AI or talk about it, people often ask, there's always this kind of narrative that, obviously there could be bad actors, people who are nefarious and planning things to use the technology in negative ways. But there's also like challenges today. Like you mentioned, we're still, like, if AI is seen as a intern and it's kind of developing into an associate, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges of maybe even the data, or if there are any type of, like, people bring up like environmental challenges or how big is this market? I mean, it's integrated into most things that we experience now. So tell us about the realities of like where AI is today and some of the challenges that surround it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a really big one, and that's the environmental impact. I'll get to that second. The first one I want to touch on is the common criticism of AI is that it's biased. And there's plenty of examples where a prompt is given and the machine gives what we would believe to be a socially unacceptable response. Yes, that happens. That said, what I go back to is that the machine is trained on the data that we as humans have generated. So when you scrape the corpus of the internet, your biases will emerge. And that's where the advent of things like synthetic data that can be created to balance the training sets that go into these models is one solution. Another solution that's currently being employed is to put prescriptive guide rails, if you will, on the system. So for example, the example that's used is a doctor treating a baby, a black doctor treating a white baby. Well, there aren't many pictures of that. So the system produces a white doctor treating a black child. But again, that's because it's what it's trained on. Now we can add prescriptive guide rails to make sure that that image comes out correctly. But I don't think we can do that at scale. So we need a better solution. And that's where the opportunity lies. That's one piece. The second piece is what you talked about, is the environmental factor. And there's two parts to that. It's the carbon emission and the water usage. So think about all the water that is required to cool these massive data centers. All these GPUs, these individual cards are in these large rooms, generating massive amounts of heat as they're training these models and responding to your queries. And air conditioning is not sufficient, so they're actually water cooled. You have places like Microsoft's data center in Iowa using 6% of the water that the city consumes in a year is going to cool this data center. Another place like Goodyear, Arizona, where Microsoft has a data center, and frankly, they blocked the local municipality from disclosing their water usage because they argued it was a competitive secret. But at the end of the day, we're talking hundreds of millions of gallons of water to cool these things. And in a changing climate, that's massively impactful. The second piece of that is the electricity that's required. And these models are being trained on carbon-based energy. They're burning natural gas here in the United States to generate this electricity. And so wind, solar, et cetera, they're variable energy loads. You cannot train a model with a variable energy load. It needs a stable energy load. So you've actually seen where Microsoft signed a deal to restart a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania and buy all of the electricity that nuclear reactor is generating. I mean, that's insane. But when you look at other countries like China, they're co-locating small nuclear reactors next to data centers because they know that is the power it will need going forward, and they can provide that base load. So again, just to kind of recap what we talked about, some of the real challenges facing AI are the biases in the data and the biased outputs that can create, and the environmental impact, both water and electricity, are real because Microsoft and Google have both come out and said they're no longer going to hit their 2030 carbon reduction goals, specifically because of the environmental cost of training AI models.
So do you believe that alternative energy, whether it is even like nuclear, like what are people, not playing around with? Because what are they strategizing towards in order to keep up with? Because this is obviously a space that's going to continue to grow exponentially, and the amount of like venture capital dollars going into AI companies is kind of off the charts. So tell us a little bit about like then.
Sure. So what we see is the large LLMs. So whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, Google Gemini, et cetera, they're so big right now that they are actually beyond the realm of what venture capital can afford. So VC is kind of moving on to funding the applications of these models. Yeah. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. But you looked at OpenAI raising hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, from individual entities, Middle East, sovereign wealth funds, et cetera, to fund their growth. It's at a scale that's just mind-boggling, frankly. I was at an event 2 weeks ago and Sam Altman was speaking, and he said, when you reach these event horizons, as he calls them, you're looking backwards, they look linear, and looking forwards, they look vertical. So it's natural to look backwards and say, well, our energy consumption is increasing at this rate. Maybe the rate is getting a little bit higher, but people are still projecting linear patterns forward. What they don't understand is that as AI becomes more embedded in our lives, the demands on these models are going to become so great that the energy consumption is actually going to grow exponentially. People have difficulty processing exponential growth. So to get back to your original question in terms of how do you address exponential growth in energy or electricity, you need large amounts of baseload, consistent electricity. And the only thing that can provide large amounts of baseload energy with carbon, the lowest carbon footprint is nuclear. And I know that's difficult for some people to grasp, but it's going to be the long-term solution, I'm afraid.
So let's switch gears now, because I think thinking about like mastery, and I think the person listening to this, and we could talk about business strategy after this section, but is generative AI. That seems to be kind of the day-to-day engagement for most people, whether they're working for a company, running their own business, or doing creative projects on the side. So when you think about like generative AI, what's been, some of the best ways to use it? I know I've heard you in the past that, don't treat it like a search engine
That's
for an
correct. Yeah.
answer. But what are some ways that people could write better prompts, engage the technology more effectively, and even like think about it as they do day-to-day tasks?
Yeah, great point. And I think I want to make a distinction that came up on a webinar that we had this past week. And that is we've used this artificial intelligence, if you will, in the past by coding, just simple coding, right? If you had an Excel macro, if you've ever coded that, that is the computer is processing a function for you, but that's prescriptive. You're going to get, it is going to achieve only the outcomes that you prescribe in that code. Where the word generative in front of AI matters, and this is things like ChatGPT, et cetera, is it's sort of yes and thinking. If you go back to the associate or analyst at your firm, an okay analyst will return the calculations you prescribed. But a great analyst is going to say, hey, I found this. I did what you said, but I also found this. And that's what AI is getting to, that also. I think that's really the easiest way I can to describe generative AI. Moving on from that is like, how do I get generative responses out of these LLMs? And I come back to a very simple model, and I call it ROCO, ROCO. If you have any ideas of how to make like a little clip, the next generation of Clippy with the name ROCO, I'm all ears. But very simple. Give it a role. So, for example, I would say I'm the CEO of a consulting firm. You are my social media manager. So right there, I've given it its role, and you can detail that more as you'd like. What are your objectives? Your objective is to maximize likes, clicks, engagements, video views, right? Whatever that is of this content for LinkedIn, for CEOs, directors, executives, etc. And those are constraints. So the objective is clicks, likes, whatever. The constraints are LinkedIn, CEOs, maybe put in the Bay Area. And then you want to tell it what is the output. The output is, don't use emojis, don't use buzzwords, or use a bulleted list, right? So these are the ways that we can engage. What is its role? It's a social media manager. What is its objective? Maximize engagement. Constraints, it's for LinkedIn and it's targeting CEOs. And what is the output? A bulleted list, no emojis, with a call to action.
That's so good. Rocco, I like it.
So it's so easy. I've tried to outthink it and it works every time. But this is where I think, Charles, I can give that framework and that's cool, right? But what people really need to do is not look at it as just, here's what I want, give me it back. It stinks. I'm going to set it aside and do it myself. Think of it as like a child, or sometimes I even treat it like a dog. Like, you got to give your dog an sit, treat, right? So say things like, great job, thank you, or good start, let me add this, or ask the LLM, show me your chain of thought, or what were the steps that you took to create this prompt? And then we can talk more about it later, but there's opportunities within LLMs to store those instructions so you can reference them going forward and begin to automate and streamline your workflows.
Yeah, I think it's good because I think most AI, software platforms I've seen will ask whether the response was a good one or not. And I think you comment back and say why it was good or why it wasn't, and it'll just kind of make the tool that much better. So when is it kind of a similar approach? Like if a small business, and I know work with both mid-sized companies, large ones, but say a small business wants to figure out how to leverage this tool, or two use cases I'd like to use. One is, I know there's listeners who are running probably smaller companies locally, thinking in terms of like, how do I leverage this for business strategy? And the second part is, I know there's also younger viewers who are pursuing careers. I think about people like my son and his friends that are like hustling, trying to get into various roles. And I see them using AI differently for their own pursuits. So since you work with college age students and you work with companies. Let's start with the companies and then go to like a college use case.
Yeah, totally. Well, actually, let's start at the very beginning and we'll work our way forward because I think that's a more natural progression. So very simply, I tell the story when I went to college. So I was in undergrad during the first .com bubble. And then that's why I moved to California, right? Go west, young man. But for me, I failed freshman calculus. So my computer science career was over before it began. But what I do with my daughter, she's 10 years old, is she can now program in her native language. She can program in English.
Yep.
And everyone who's listening to this is a computer programmer because you can program these LLMs in English, in Spanish, French, etc., but in your native language. That's massive. That is a massively scaling function. That said, moving forward, how does it work in a university setting? So I can tell from a mile away if a student has used AI very simply because I take my prompt, say it's an essay, I take my essay prompt, I put it into ChatGPT. I said, okay, in the 5th paragraph, it gave me this example. And then I go to if my students have a similar example in the 5th paragraph of their essay, right? Then I know that they didn't put any thought into this. And that's the key element that whether you're a student or a professional, the human in the loop. AI is not good enough to be hands-off. I can't emphasize enough. It is not good enough to be hands-off. So for someone like your son trying to get a job, he can write 50 cover letters a day, but his hit rate's probably going to be pretty low. Whereas if he uses AI as a partner, and this is where I talk about human augmentation, right? Not replacing people, but augmenting their efforts. He may be able to write 10 cover letters a day instead of 5, but those 10 cover letters are going to be great because he had a thought partner and he remained in the loop to edit the outcome. So that's one of the key ways as a college student you can begin to leverage AI.
That's great. How about for a small business? I'm starting
perfect.
off. I'm a small business entrepreneur. I'm thinking about like, okay, how do I reach my market? Like, what are some things that you would think about right off the top of your head?
Totally. So one thing that AI is really good at doing is finding connections between data that we don't think matters because it has no bias. On one hand, people say it may have biased data, but on the other hand, it can actually ignore our human biases of experience. I've been in this industry 30 years. I know that customers shop on Saturdays, whatever that is. But the amount of data points or variables that the human mind can process is less than the model can process. So one of the biggest examples I find is for me to just say, here's the day I posted my LinkedIn post, and here are the number of likes. 2 columns. And it'll say, oh, great. Well, Jeff, you should post the most on Tuesdays. Well, it's not telling you maybe Tuesday is the most popular day on LinkedIn, and it actually has nothing to do with my content. So that's like a perfect example of how, as a small business, what we actually need to do is we need to start pulling that apart. And we might need to say, what day did we post it? What time? What type of content? And what were the number of likes? And then in your prompt to AI, you are my social media manager. Your objective is to find the best day and time to post what type of content. Your constraint is, please normalize my data for LinkedIn trends, i.e. over engagement on Tuesdays, under engagement on weekends, etc. And give me 3 actionable insights. Don't give me 5, don't give me 10, don't give me 1, give me 3. And then have a dialogue with that. So again, that's just how you take a data set, add a little more context, turn it over to the machine prompted by that ROCO framework, and you'll find insights in your data.
That's good. That's so good. So, when since we're talking about various, like, there's strengths of all of these various tools, ChatGPT 4 or Claude or Gemini, walk us through, because I think, there's certain tools, a little bit of, a tech stack, if you will, that I use, but like, I'd love to kind of hear from you, like, what are some of the things that you find really useful in some of these specific platforms?
Yeah, the first thing I do is I start from a human-centered perspective. And am I ready to take on 5 or 6 new applications so that I put AI in my business? I'm not. I don't have the
Yeah.
time to learn those platforms. And if I hire someone to run those platforms, then I have to train them anyway. The point is that it's just this huge investment of time. So with that being said, I've actually found that a lot of the plugins that I've bought or feature specific applications I've subscribed to, those features quickly become, or those standalone products quickly become features of the existing LLM. Perfect example is there's a platform that I use to transcribe my podcast. So I upload the MP3, it gives me the transcript back. Well, now I said, why don't I just go to ChatGPT and I say, write me a program that does this. And so I can do that for free, or maybe just the cost of the tokens, not the overhead that I'm providing this other provider. So that's $200 a year I save. Another program that I use is Jasper, and Jasper is meant to help create social media content, etc. And its original premise was that it could take additional content, pull some information online, and give you the most relevant, build posts, build campaigns, etc. Sure. You can build bots now on ChatGPT that do that for you. So again, now is that a platform that I'm going to renew? Probably not, right? Because what it was offering is now a feature of something else. So my point being is don't spend a lot of time learning these individual programs. Understand what you're trying to achieve and do your best to maximize that within your LLM. And don't get caught up in this chasing the next feature or the next program, because it's ultimately going to become a feature of the existing platform.
I think that's a good balance. But in each example you gave, you still kind of jumped into those programs to just kind of see how it works. And then you applied your learnings and brought it back into an environment that you could control yourself, right?
100%, Charles. And one program that I will, and I'm no vested interest in this whatsoever, but there's a program called Descript, for example, where it takes a video that you record and you can edit the text, the transcript. It edits the video based on your edits to the transcript. That's pretty impressive. And so an LLM can't do that today. So that's a program, right, for example, that's going to continue to add value to me. But I would rather have one or two other programs adding value than 6 programs if I instead just taking the time to really understand what that core platform, ChatGPT, Claude, etc., can achieve.
Good. So let's end with this, because I think bringing a full circle at the beginning, we talked about a lot of this you can program in English or whatever language, native tongue you come from. So what are some skills that people should maybe develop, or they already have, they should highlight in order to work effectively with?
The first one's creativity. You asked whether you have children going into college, children have just graduated college, etc. Emphasize creative thinking, curiosity, and empathy. The machines will never be able to recreate that human connection. So there are some people, I think, who are going to be disappointed that the computer science degree may not be as valuable as it used to be, because many of these LLMs, like ChatGPT and Claude, for instance, are optimizing for code generation. And that's if you're a software company, 80% of your budget goes to actually creating that software. And the marginal cost is very small, but that upfront number is big. And these LLMs can lower that upfront number, then that's less coders and programmers that are going to be needed. So I think it's to understand what LLMs do well, but also what the companies are optimizing for. And they say this in their press releases. It's not a secret. And guide your students to some place that's less obvious. So I was at a conference back in September, and one of the AI leaders from Google said, liberal arts, go get a philosophy degree. Just understand the frameworks. Because if you go back to that Roku example that I gave you, that's a framework. The AI is going to be optimized by you giving it a framework. And when you're prompting it and you're trying to guide it towards another direction, and you say you're a social media manager, well, you might say you're a social media manager specializing in this sales tactic or this marketing philosophy. And if you can give it that context, it will be that much more effective. So think about building that empathy, building that creativity, building that curiosity. And it doesn't stop with college students. If you're an employee in a company or you're a manager, director, CEO, etc., just think of all the information that's kept in spreadsheets in your company. Start there. And how do you begin to aggregate that and drive new insights from that? Your biggest challenge, my opinion, is going to be the change resistance among your people, because they've invested their career in generating this tribal knowledge. That's their value. And if you take away that tribal knowledge, do they feel like their career is in jeopardy? And so a little bit of a gas and clutch, all right? You can't go full throttle on AI. You need to be mindful of how your people are going to internalize the transition. But ultimately, going back to what I said, you will get connections between data you never understood, and it'll drive tremendous value.
Jeff, this has been so good. Thanks so much for taking some time to speak to our audience, and look forward to future conversations as this field evolves.
Yeah, my pleasure, Charles. Thank you so much. It's been great being here. And for folks, Charles will put my LinkedIn in the notes. You can always connect with me there. And also my podcast, where Charles has delayed his appearance, but that's okay. We still love him because he has a big announcement in the background, so it's okay. But I've just been honored to be here, and let's keep the dialogue going.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Jeff.